The plan and the capture. The head of the army and the head of the Air Force stood at attention beside the Queen's breakfast table. Sophie was still in her seat, and the BFG was still high up on his crazy perch. It took the Queen only 5 minutes to explain the situation to the military men. I knew there was something like this going on, Your Majesty, the head of the army said. For the last 10 years, we have been getting reports from nearly every country in the world about people disappearing mysteriously in the night. We had only one the other day from Panama. For the hatty taste, cried the BFG. And one from Wellington in New Zealand, said the head of the army. For bloody flavor, cried the BFG. What is he talking about, said the head of the Air Force. Work it out for yourself, the Queen said. What time is it? 10 a.m.? In 8 hours, those 9 bloodthirsty brutes will be galloping off to gobble up another couple of dozen unfortunate wretches. They have to be stopped. We must act fast. We'll bomb the blighters, shouted the head of the Air Force. We'll mow them down with machine guns, cried the head of the army. I do not approve of murder, the Queen said. But they are murderers themselves, cried the head of the army. That is no reason why we should follow their example, the Queen said. 2 wrongs don't make a right. And 2 rights don't make a left, cried the BFG. We must bring them back alive, the Queen said. How? The 2 military men said together. They are all 50 feet high. They'd knock us down like 9 pins. Wait, cried the BFG. Hold your horseflies. Keep your skirts on. I think I has the answer to the maiden's hair. Let him speak, the Queen said. Every afternoon, the BFG said, all these giants is in the land of Noddy. I can't understand a word this fellow says, the head of the army snapped. Why doesn't he just speak clearly? He means the land of Nod, Sophie said. It's pretty obvious. Exunkly, cried the BFG. Every afternoon, all these 9 giants is lying on the ground snoozling away in a very deep sleep. They is always resting like that before they is galloping off to guzzle another helping of human beings. Go on, they said. So what? So what you soldiers has to do is to creep up to the giants while they is still in the land of Noddy and tie their arms and legs with mighty ropes and wonky chains. Brilliant, the Queen said. That's all very well, said the head of the army, but how do we get the brutes back here? We can't load 50-foot giants onto the trucks. Shoot 'em on the spot, that's what I say. The BFG looked down from his lofty perch and said, this time to the head of the Air Force, you is having belly poppers, is you not? Is he being rude, the head of the Air Force said. He means helicopters, Sophie told him. Then why doesn't he say so? Of course we have helicopters. Wopsy big belly poppers, asked the BFG. Very big ones, the head of the Air Force said proudly, but no helicopter is big enough to get a giant like that inside it. You don't put him inside, the BFG said. You sling him underneath the belly of your belly popper and carry him like a torpedo. Like a what? The head of the Air Force said. Like a torpedo, Sophie said. Could you do that, Air Marshal? The Queen asked. Well, I suppose we could, the head of the Air Force admitted grudgingly. Then get cracking, the Queen said. You'll need 9 helicopters, 1 for each giant. Where is this place? The Air Force man said to the BFG. I presume you can pinpoint it on the map. Pinpoint, said the BFG. Map? I is never hearing these words before. Is this Air Force bean talking slush bungle? The Air Force Marshal's face turned the color of a ripe plum. He was not used to being told he was talking slush bungle. The Queen, with her usual admiral tact and good sense, came to the rescue. BFG, she said, can you tell us more or less where this giant country is? No, Magister, the BFG said, not on my Nelly. Then we're jiggered, cried the Army General. This is ridiculous, cried the Air Marshal. You must not be given up so easy, the BFG said calmly. The first titchy bobstickle you meet and you begin shouting, you is Biff Squiggled. The Army General was no more used to being insulted than the Air Marshal. His face began to swell with fury and his cheeks blew out until they looked like 2 huge ripe tomatoes. Your Majesty, he cried, we are dealing with a lunatic. I want nothing more to do with this ridiculous operation. The Queen, who was used to the tantrums of her senior officials, ignored him completely. BFG, she said, would you please tell these rather dim-witted characters exactly what to do? A pleasure, Magister, said the BFG. Now listen to me carefully, you 2 boot bogglers. The military men began to twitch, but they stayed put. I is not having the foggiest idea where Giant Country is in the world, the BFG said, but I is always able to gallop there. I is galloping forwards and backwards from Giant Country every night to blow my dreams into little Chidler's bedrooms. I is knowing the way very well. So all yous having to do is this: put your 9 big belly hoppers up in the air and let them follow me as I is galloping along. How long will the journey take? The Queen asked. If we is leaving now, the BFG said, we will be arriving just as the giants is having their afternoon snozzle. Splendid, said the Queen. Then turning to the military men, she said, prepare to leave immediately. The head of the army, who was feeling pretty miffed by the whole business, said, that's all very well, Your Majesty, but what are we going to do with the blighters once we get them back? Don't you worry about that, the Queen told him. We'll be ready for them. Hurry up now, off you go. If it pleases Your Majesty, Sophie said, I should like to ride with the BFG to keep him company. Where will you sit? Asked the Queen. In his ear, Sophie said. Show them, BFG. The BFG got down from his high chair. He picked up Sophie with his fingers. He swiveled his right ear until it was parallel with the ground and then placed Sophie gently inside. The heads of the army and the Air Force stood there, goggling. The Queen smiled. You really are rather a wonderful giant, aren't you? She said. Magister, the BFG said, I is wishing to ask a very special thing from you. What is it? The Queen said. Could I please bring back here in the belly hoppers all my collection of dreams? They has taken me years and years to collect, and I is not wanting to lose them. Why, of course, the Queen said. I wish you a safe journey. The BFG had made thousands of journeys to and from Giant Country over the years, but he had never in his life made one quite like this. With 9 huge helicopters roaring along just ahead over his head, he had never before traveled in broad daylight either. He hadn't dared to, but this was different. Now he was doing it for the Queen of England herself, and he was frightened of nobody. As he galloped across the British Isles with the helicopters thundering above him, people stood and gaped and wondered what on earth was going on. They had never seen the likes of it before, and they never would again. Every now and then the pilots of the helicopters would catch a glimpse of a small girl wearing glasses crouching in the giant's right ear and waving to them. They always waved back. The pilots marveled at the giant's speed and at the way he leapt across wide rivers and over huge houses. But they hadn't seen anything yet. Be careful to hang on tight, the BFG said. We is going fast as Fizzlecrump. The BFG changed into his famous top gear, and all at once he began to fly forward as though there were springs in his legs and rockets in his toes. He went skimming over the earth like some magical hop, skip, and jumper, with his feet hardly ever touching the ground. As usual, Sophie had to crouch low in the crevice of his ear to save herself from being swept clean away. The 9 pilots in their helicopters suddenly realized they were being left behind. The giant was streaking ahead. They opened their throttles to full speed, and even then they were only just able to keep up. In the leading machine, the head of the Air Force was sitting beside the pilot. He had a world atlas on his knees, and he kept staring first at the atlas, then at the ground below, trying to figure out where they were going. Frantically, he turned the pages of the atlas. Where the devil are we going? He cried. I haven't the foggiest idea, the pilot answered. The Queen's orders were to follow the giant, and that's exactly what I'm doing. The pilot was a young Air Force officer with a bushy mustache. He was very proud of his mustache. He was also quite fearless, and he loved adventure. He thought this was a super adventure. It's fun going to new places, he said. New places, shouted the head of the Air Force. What the blazes do you mean, new places? This place we're flying over now isn't in the atlas, is it? The pilot said, grinning. You're darn right it isn't in the atlas, cried the head of the Air Force. We've flown clear off the last page. I expect that old giant knows where he's going, the young pilot said. He's leading us into disaster, cried the head of the Air Force. He was shaking with fear, and the seat behind him sat the head of the army, who was even more terrified. You don't mean to tell me we've gone right out of the atlas, he cried, leaning forward to look. That's exactly what I'm telling you, cried the Air Force man. Look for yourself. Here's the very last map in the whole flamin' atlas. We went off that over an hour ago." He turned the page. As in all atlases, there were two completely blank pages at the very end. "So now we must be somewhere over here." He pointed on one of the blank pages. "Where's here?" cried the head of the army. The young pilot was still grinning broadly. He said to them, "That's why they always put two blank pages at the back of the atlas. They're for new countries. You're meant to fill them in yourself." The head of the Air Force glanced down at the ground below. "Just look at this godforsaken desert," he cried. "All the trees are dead and all the rocks are blue." "The giant has stopped," the young pilot said. "He's waving us down." The pilots throttled back the engines and all 9 helicopters landed safely on the great yellow wasteland. Then each of them lowered a ramp from its belly. 9 jeeps, one for each helicopter, were driven down the ramps. Each jeep contained 6 soldiers and a vast quantity of thick rope and heavy chains. "I don't see any giants," the head of the army said. "The giants is all just out of sight over there," the BFG told him. "But if you was taking these slash-buckling, noisy belly poppers any closer, all the giants is waking up at once, and then pop goes the weasel." "So you just want us to proceed by jeep?" the head of the army said. "Yes," the BFG said. "You must all be very, very hushy quiet. No roaring of motors, no shouting, no mucking about, no piggery-jokery." The BFG, with Sophie still in his ear, trotted forward, and the jeeps followed close behind. Suddenly, the most dreadful rumbling noise was heard by everyone. The head of the army went pea-green in the face. "Those are guns!" he cried. "There is a battle raging somewhere up ahead of us. Turn back, the lot of you. Let's get out of here." "Pig's piffle," the BFG said. "Those noises are not guns." "Of course they're guns," shouted the head of the army. "I'm a military man, and I know a gun when I hear one. Turn back." "Those is just the giants snortling in their sleep," the BFG said. "I is a giant myself, and I know a giant snortle as I is hearing one." "Are you quite sure?" the army man said anxiously. "Positive," the BFG said. "Proceed cautiously," the army man ordered. They all moved on. Then they saw them. Even at a distance, there were enough to scare the daylights out of the soldiers. But when they got close and saw what the giants really looked like, they began to sweat with fear. 9 fearsome, ugly, half-naked, 50 feet long brutes lay sprawled over the ground in various grotesque attitudes of sleep, and the sound of their snorting was indeed like gunfire in battle. The BFG raised a hand. The jeeps all stopped. The soldiers got out. "What happens if one of them wakes up?" whispered the head of the army, his knees knocking together from fear. "If any one of them is waking up, he will gobble you down before you can say knack knife," the BFG answered, grinning hugely. "Me is the only one what won't be gobbled up, because giants has never eaten giants. Me and Sophie is the only safe ones, because I is hiding her if that happens." The head of the army took several paces to the rear. So did the head of the Air Force. They climbed rather quickly back into their jeep, ready to make a fast getaway if necessary. "Go forward, men," the head of the army said. "Go forward and do your duty bravely." The soldiers crept forward with their ropes and chains. All of them were trembling mightily. None dared to speak a word. The BFG, with Sophie now sitting on the palm of his hand, stood near by watching the operation. To give the soldiers their due, they were extremely courageous. There were 6 well-trained, efficient men working on each giant, and within 10 minutes, 8 out of the 9 giants had been trussed up like chickens and were still snoring contentedly. The 9th, who happened to be the flesh lump eater, was causing trouble for the soldiers because he was lying with his right arm tucked underneath his enormous body. It was impossible to tie his wrists and arms together without first getting that arm out from underneath him. Very, very cautiously, the 6 soldiers who were working on the flesh lump eater began to pull at the huge arm, trying to release it. The flesh lump eater opened his tiny piggy black eyes. "Which of you foul pesters is wiggling my arm?" he bellowed. "Is that you, you rotsome man hugger?" Suddenly he saw the soldiers. In a flash he was sitting up. He looked around him. He saw more soldiers. With a roar, he leapt to his feet. The soldiers, petrified with fear, froze where they were. They had no weapons with them. The head of the army put his jeep in reverse. Human beings, the flesh lump eater yelled. What is all you flush bunkin' rotten half-baked beans doing in our country? He made a grab at a soldier and swept him up in his hand. I is having early suppers today, he shouted, holding the poor squirming soldier at arm's length and roaring with laughter. Sophie, standing on the palm of the BFG's hand, was watching horror struck. Do something, she cried. Quick, before he eats him. Put that human being down, the BFG shouted. The flesh lump eater turned and stared at the BFG. What is you doing here with all these grotty twiglets? He bellowed. You is making me very suspicious. The BFG made a rush at the flesh lump eater, but the colossal 54-foot-high giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his free arm. At the same time, Sophie fell off of the BFG's palm to the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something. She must. She remembered the sapphire brooch the queen had pinned onto her chest. Quickly, she undid it. I is guzzling you nice and slow, the flesh lump eater was saying to the soldier in his hand. Then I is guzzling 10 or 20 more of you midgy little maggots down there. You was not getting away from me because I is galloping 50 times faster than you. Sophie ran up to the behind the flesh lump eater. She was holding the brooch between her two fingers. When she was right up close to the great naked hairy legs, she rammed the 3-inch long pin of the brooch as hard as she could into the flesh lump eater's right ankle. It went deep into the flesh and stayed there. The giant gave a roar of pain and jumped high in the air. He dropped the soldier and made a grab for his ankle. The BFG, knowing what a coward the flesh lump eater was, saw his chance. You was bitten by a snake, he shouted. I seed it biting you. It was a frightsome, poison-voiced viper. It was a dreadly, dangerous vidscreen viper. Save our souls, bellowed the flesh lump eater. Sound the crumpets. I is bitten by a septitious, venomsome windscreen viper. He flopped to the ground and sat there, howling his head off and clutching his ankle with both hands. His fingers felt the brooch. The teeth of the deadly viper is still sticking into me, he yelled. I is feeling the teeth sticking into my anklet. The BFG saw his second chance. We must be getting those viper's teeth out at once, he cried. Otherwise, you is deader than duck soup. I is helping you. The BFG knelt down beside the flesh lump eater. You must grab your anklet very high with both hands, he ordered. That will stop the poisonous juices from the venomsome viper going down and up into your leg and into your heart. The flesh lump eater grabbed his ankle with both hands. Now close your eyes and grittle your teeth and look up to heaven and say your prayers while I is taking out the teeth of the venomous viper, the BFG said. The terrified flesh lump eater did exactly as he was told. The BFG signaled for some rope. A soldier rushed it over to him. With both the flesh lump eater's hands gripping his ankle, it was a simple matter for the BFG to tie the ankles and hands together with a tight knot. I is pulling out the frightsome viper's teeth, the BFG said as he pulled the knot tight. Do it quickly, shouted the flesh lump eater, before I is pizened to death. There we is, said the BFG, standing up. You can look now. When the flesh lump eater saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell so loud that the heavens trembled. He rolled and he wriggled, he fought and he friggled, he squirmed and he squiggled, but there was not a thing he could do. Well done, Sophie cried. Well done, you, said the BFG, smiling down at the little girl. You was saving all our lives. Will you please get that brooch back for me, Sophie said. It belongs to the queen. The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flesh lump eater's ankle. The flesh lump eater howled. The BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had woken up during this schmizmazel. When you was only sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day, you was sleeping extra doubly deep, the BFG explained. The heads of the Army and the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep. Her Majesty will be very pleased with me, the head of the Army said. I shall probably get a medal. What's the next move? Now you was all driving over to my cave to load up my bottles of dreams, the BFG said. We can't waste time with that rubbish, the Army General said. It is the Queen's order, Sophie said. She was now back in the BFG's hand. So the 9 jeeps drove across to the BFG's cave and the great dream loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars in all to be loaded up, more than 5,000 to each jeep, and it took over an hour to finish the job. While the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains on a mysterious errand. When they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his shoulder. What's that you got there? The head of the army demanded to know. Curiosity is killing the rat, the BFG said, and he turned away from the silly man. When he was sure that all his precious dreams had been safely loaded onto the jeeps, the BFG said, Now, we is driving back to the belly poppers and picking up the frightsome giants. The jeeps drove back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully, jar by jar, onto the helicopters. The soldiers climbed back on board, but the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were lying. It was a fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the trussed up giants. It was an even fitter, finer sight to see the giants being woken up by the terrified thundering of the engines overhead. And the finest sight of all was to observe those 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting about on the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from their ropes and chains. I is flesh-bunkled, roared the flesh-lump-eater. I is spitz-wiggled, cried the child-chewer. I is swog-swallowed, bellowed the bone-cruncher. I is goose-gruggled, howled the man-hugger. I is gunsel-swiped, shouted the meat-dripper. I is flunk-gungled, screamed the maid-masher. I is slop-groggled, squawked the gizzard-gulper. I is cried-squinkled, yelled the blood-bottler. I is bop-muggered, screeched the butcher boy. The 9 giant carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant and hovered directly over him. Very strong steel hawsers with hooks on the ends of them were lowered from the front and rear of the helicopter. The BFG quickly secured the hooks to the giant's chains, one hook near the legs and the other near the arms. Then very slowly the giants were winched up into the air parallel with the ground. The giants roared and bellowed, but there was nothing they could do. The BFG, with Sophie once more resting comfortably in his ear, set off at a gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. It was an amazing spectacle, those 9 helicopters winging through the sky, each with a trussed-up 50-foot-long giant slung underneath it. The giants themselves must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing, but their howls were drowned by the noise of the engines. When it began to get dark, the helicopters switched on powerful searchlights and trained them on to the galloping giant so as to keep him in sight. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking.